I'm a biochemist, an RNA biochemist. I came to Yale in '95. I'm a professor in the molecular biophysics and biochemistry department. And we do structural as well as biochemical studies, and so we think about what RNA looks like in 3 dimensions and how that structure affects its function. This is sort of related to that in a sort of 3-dimensional sense, but it's more related to it in the I like to work at the bench sense. And when I was a postdoc and a graduate student, and even as a starting professor, I could work at the bench all the time. Now what I find is that when I work at the bench, I don't do as good a job mentoring students because I get distracted by the projects that I'm working on. And so this is an opportunity to do something with my hands, tactile. At the end of the day, you can see what you've finished. It's actually, therapeutic isn't maybe the right word, but it sort of feels therapeutic. To spend a couple hours getting really dirty and making a big mess, and at the end of the day being able to point to something that you made. So it's totally a hobby that involved beginning with making furniture, and at some point I filled my house with furniture and decided I wanted to learn how to turn wood. And pretty quickly all the furniture had bowls on top of all of it, and my wife reached the point where I had to get rid of some of them. And so at one point I turned a bowl from a tree that was from on campus, from in front of the admissions building, and showed it to my wife and said, "Look, it's a Yale bowl." And we thought that was kind of funny. And so the next idea was I wonder if somebody would be interested in a Yale bowl, and so we put a little website together, and people have been purchasing them for the past 3 years. So we start with getting a log from somewhere on campus, and then usually that's cut in half, right down the length, kind of like you're splitting it with an axe, but I do it with a chainsaw. Those I like to let dry for at least a few days, because if you take logs that are really fresh and put them on the lathe, they're really wet. And then you end up with water all over your tools and all over yourself, and particularly if you're turning in the winter, it gets really cold. I then turn them round so that they're roughly the shape of a bowl, and I do that on the bandsaw. And then mount them to the lathe and rough turn them. So for example, there's some bowls behind me that have been rough turned, so they are roughly the shape that you want, but they're really thick. And what that does is it allows them to dry much faster than they would if you were just leaving the wood to dry. That would literally take years. So we rough turn them, and then it takes somewhere between 6 months and a year sitting in the garage or in the shed for them to get to the point where they're dry enough that you can finish turn them and then not have them warp in a serious way when they're finished. So here's an example of a rough turn cherry that was on Prospect Street. And you can see that it's not very round anymore, right? So it's gone with the grain, it's gone long, and across the grain it's gotten narrow. And so this is, if we put this back on the lathe, the first thing we need to do is true the tenon so that we can mount it into the chuck, and then round the outside, invert it, put that into the chuck, and then do the inside and do a bunch of sanding. Okay, so these rough turn bowls then are finished turned, sanded, and then finish placed on them, and then they're done. So it's a process that takes about a year from beginning to end. What I do at work is a lot of mentoring people and writing and email correspondence and writing scientific papers and editing and trying to make decisions about what happens to a campus and all these kinds of administrative things. And this is just a totally out there creative outlet that is just an expression of a different part of me than I get anywhere else in what I do.